The first example that we'll be doing is we're going to convert from a fraction to a decimal. The fraction that we'll be using is 5 over 8. That horizontal line is called a vinculum, and it tells you that we're going to divide the numerator by the denominator. 5 divided by 8. Since we're dividing by 8, that means we're counting by 8. So let's write down our multiples of 8. 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 48, 56. Now we're going to ask ourselves, can 8 go into 5? If you have trouble dividing, think about this. Can a size 8 person fit into a size 5 jean pants? The answer is no. Okay? Now we're going to add a decimal and another 0. Make sure you bring your decimal up. Can 8 go into 50? 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 48. So it goes in there 6 times. So I'm going to write 6 above 0. And then I'm going to write 48. I'm going to find the difference. 0 minus 8, we cannot do that, so we need to borrow from the 5, our next door neighbor. And this 0 changes to a 10. We have 10 ones. 10 minus 8 is 2. 4 minus 4 is 0. We still have a remainder of 2, so we're going to add another 0 and bring it down. 8 goes into 20 2 times. 8 times 2 is 16, and then we're going to find the difference. 0 minus 6, we cannot do that, so we need to borrow from our next door neighbor 2. This 2 changes to a 1, and the 0 changes to a 10. 10 minus 6 is 4. 1 minus 1 is 0. We still have a remainder, so let's add another 0. Bring it down. 8 goes into 40 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Let's write the 5 up here. 8 times 5 is 40, and then we're going to find the difference. 40 minus 40 is 0. So we can say that 5/8 equals to 625 thousandths. Next, we'll be converting decimal to percent. The example that we'll be using is from our previous example, 625 thousandths. So let's write that down. Now the rule to this is that we're going to move the decimal point 2 to the right. So if I move the decimal point 625 thousandths, 1, 2, the new decimal will be in between 2 and 5. So we can say that 625 thousandths is equivalent to 62.5%, or 62.5%. Now you may be wondering, what if the number doesn't have a decimal? So for example, let's say we have 7 whole, or 7. Think of money in this case. If we have $7, our decimal, we can write this number as 7 and 0 hundredth, or $7. That is the same thing as 7. So then we can change this to a percent by moving the decimal place 2 to the right. So let's move it 1, 2, and that will give us 700%. Our third example is percent to fraction. Let's use 20%. 20%. Now the rule with percent is that we know that percent is always out of 100. So what I mean by that is, on a grade for homework or a test, you know that your maximum grade will be 100%. So if you get a 20% of this on your test, that means out of 100, you got 20% of the question correct. So 20% is equals to 20 over 100. Now that y'all are in middle school, we're going to have to simplify. So 20 over 100 is also equivalent to So 20 over 100, in order to find the equivalent fraction, we need to find a factor that goes into both 20 and 100. (20 and 100). So let's write down some factors that can go into both 20 and 100. 1 times 20 is 20.
2 times 10 is 20. 3 times, we can't do 3, so let's do 4 times 5. Now for 100. 1 times 100 is 100. We know 100 is an even number because it ends in 0. 2 times 50 is 100. 3 doesn't work. Let's do 4. How many? We know that 4 quarters is 100, or a dollar. 4 quarters is a dollar. 5 times $20 bills is 100. And then $10, we have $10 to make a $100 bill.
Now you see that we repeated the number 10. So that means we know we're done. Makes another horseshoe. Now from this, we're going to have to see what are the common factors that we have for 20 and 100. We know we got ones, so let's just circle it.
We got 2 since they're both even numbers. We got 4. We also have 5. And we have 10. And we have also 20.
So when you simplify fraction, we're going to use the greatest common factor. In this case, the greatest common factor is the number 20. So we're going to divide both the numerator and the denominator by 20. 20 divided by 20 is going to give me 1. 100 divided by 20 is going to give us 5. So 1/5 is a simplified version of our fraction 20 over 100. Decimal to fraction. (75 hundredth). Now the rule to go from a decimal to fraction is that we're gonna have to read it and then write it and then simplify it. We're reading it as 75/100th. So we're going to write it out of 100, we have 75, 75/100th. And then we're going to simplify it if we can. Now we have 75 and 100. We know that 75 ends in the number 5 and the ones for 100 is 0. So if we have 5 and 0, we know that a common factor is that they're both divisible by 5. So we can divide both number by 5. And we should get so 75 divided by 5 . 5 can go into 7 once with the remainder of 2 and bring down the 5. 5 can go into 25 5 times. 15. 100 divided by 5, we can look over here and we know 5 times 20 is 100, so 100 divided by 5 is 20. Now here we see that 15 over 20 is not the simplest form because we can divide by 5 again. So 15 divided by 5 is 3 and 20 divided by 5 is 4. Now we have our fraction 3 over 4. That is the most simplest. Now, if you look at this, we simplified it twice. We have 5 here and another 5. So if you combine or multiply these two, 5 times 5 will be 25. So we could have done 75 over 100 and divide each by 25. If we think of quarters, 75 divided by 25, okay, we have 3 quarters, and in 100 or $1 we have 4 quarters. Same answer. Next, we'll be converting from a percent to a decimal. Our example that we'll be using is 20%. If we look to the left, our rule from decimal to percent was to move the decimal point 2 to the right. So to go from a percent to decimal, we'll need to move the decimal point 2 to the left. So here we have 20%. There isn't a decimal, so we can assume that the decimal will be all the way to the right side. 20%. If we put it here between the 2 and the 0, it will not be a 20%, but it will actually be 2%, which changes the value. So to go from a percent to decimal, we need to move the decimal point 2 to the left. 1, 2. So 20% is equivalent to 0 and 20/100th. Another example is if we were given a percentage with a decimal point. So for example, 47 and 0.3%, the rule still applies. To go from a percent to decimal, we need to move the decimal point 2 to the left. 1, 2. So the equivalent decimal form of 47 and 0.3% is actually 0 and 473 thousandths. The last example that we have is going from a fraction to percent. Now if you look on the left side, we have a fraction 1/5. Let's try to see if we can get it to 20%. Now there's two ways to do this. The first way applies to denominators that have a factor of 100. So if we look at 5, our denominator 5, to get to 100, we can do 5 times 20. So whatever you do at the bottom, make sure you do it also to the top. 5 times 20, and in the numerator, 1 times 20. That's going to give us 20 over 100. Now right here, we wrote that percent is always out of 100. So we got our denominator to be 100. So whatever is our numerator is going to represent the percentage for it. So if we have 20 out of 100, our percentage is going to be 20%. Now the second way. Let's use the same fraction, 1 over 5. Let's say we forgot that 5 is a factor of 100. So we have a two-step. So first we can convert from a fraction to a decimal, and then from a decimal to percent. So to go from a fraction to a decimal, we need to divide. Remember, numerator divided by the denominator. 5 cannot go into 1. So let's add a decimal and a 0 and bring your decimal up. 5 can go into 10. Let's write down our multiples. 5, 10, 2 times. Make sure you subtract, and our difference is 0. So we know that 1/5 is equivalent to the decimal form 2/10. Now to go from a decimal to percent, remember we're moving the decimal point 2 to the right. So let's move 1, 2. Every time you move and there's an empty placeholder, we can just substitute it with a 0. So we know that 2/10 or 20/100 is equivalent to 20%.